A mother in Harare lights a small candle in the corner of her kitchen, not for comfort, but because the power has been out for 16 hours straight. The refrigerator has gone warm. The medicine she keeps for her diabetic husband is spoiling. In the distance, the low, mechanical scream of a hospital generator cuts through the night, a reminder that even surgeries are at the mercy of a failing grid. This has been life in Zimbabwe days, defined by darkness factories, silenced by blackout, and an entire nation forced to ration hope 1 hour at a time. And then just 3 days ago, everything changed. In a moment that stunned even seasoned analysts, Africa's richest man walked into State House in Harare and signed a deal that could rewrite the economic future of Southern Africa. One signature, $1 billion. And suddenly, the map of the region is no longer the same. Western oil executives are watching. Chinese state companies are watching. Even Zimbabwe's neighbors, Botswana, Zambia, Malawi, are quietly recalculating what this means for their own future. Because what happened is not just a business deal. It is a shift in power. A landlocked nation, one that has spent decades crippled by fuel shortages and energy dependency, is now preparing to build a 2,000-kilometer pipeline straight from the Atlantic coast, a lifeline that has the potential to turn Zimbabwe from a victim of geography into an unexpected energy hub. And the biggest question echoing tonight is simple 6. Why now? What changed after 10 long years? And how did a country the world once wrote off manage to attract a deal that could transform half a continent? If you've been following Africa news closely, you know these seismic shifts rarely happen by accident. We've seen it in Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré. When a nation changes the rules, the world has no choice but to react. So stay with me. This story is bigger than one pipeline, bigger than one billionaire, bigger than one country's hope for electricity. It's about whether Africa can finally build on its own terms. If you believe truth matters more than headlines, make sure you stay to the end. The story of what happened in Zimbabwe doesn't begin with the billion-dollar signature. It begins with a sound, the sharp metallic click of a light switch that no longer responds. For years, Zimbabweans lived with that silence. In homes from Harare to Bulawayo, families pressed switches out of habit only to remember that the electricity had vanished again. Children tried to finish homework by candlelight. Restaurant owners stood helpless as fridges shut down, wasting food they could barely afford. And every night, the distant rumble of generators echoed across cities like a restless heartbeat, reminding everyone just how fragile life had become. 12. At the core of this national struggle was a simple, devastating truth. Zimbabwe had run out of power, literally. The Kariba Dam, long the lifeline of Zimbabwe and Zambia, fell to just 9% of its generating capacity after years of drought. Even hospitals were forced to rotate electricity between departments. Patients scheduled for surgery were told to wait. Dialysis machines shut down mid-treatment. And the mining sector, the country's biggest source of revenue, found itself trapped, unable to operate equipment that required stable power for even a single shift. The economic impact was staggering. The World Bank estimated that these blackouts swallowed 6.1% of Zimbabwe's GDP every year. That's not an abstract number. It is factories that never reopened, investors who never returned, and thousands of families who watched their jobs evaporate. It is the quiet tragedy of a nation suffocating under darkness. But beneath that crisis was a deeper structural problem, one far harder to fix. Zimbabwe is landlocked. Not a drop of fuel enters the country without crossing long, costly, politically sensitive routes through Mozambique or South Africa. Each mile added risk. Each checkpoint added cost. Each political disagreement added delays. Investors saw these bottlenecks and simply walked away. They believed the geography alone made serious industrial development impossible. And then came a turning point no one expected. Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote, who once rejected Zimbabwe entirely, returned with a proposal that would reshape the region. 10 years earlier, he walked away from the very same country, reportedly after high-ranking officials demanded mediation fees and special clearances to move his projects forward. The environment was too murky, too unpredictable, too hostile. Dangote's withdrawal sent a message across the continent: Zimbabwe was too risky. So when word spread that he had landed in Harare in November 2025, people whispered, was it true? Was he really back? Was the country finally ready for a deal of this magnitude? On November 12, 2025, inside State House Harare, the moment arrived. Dangote and President Emerson Mnangagwa signed a $1 billion agreement that stunned the region. But the awe didn't come from the number itself. It came from what the number represented. Western companies had quoted $10–15 billion for the same work. Chinese state firms demanded ownership stakes on top of inflated construction costs. But Dangote, using the same strategy he pioneered in Nigeria, planned to build everything: pipeline storage terminals, cement factories, fertilizer plants at a fraction of the foreign cost. And here was the centerpiece: 2020. A 2,000-kilometer pipeline running from Walvis Bay in Namibia, cutting across Botswana and ending in Bulawayo. 21's Hoyt. For Zimbabweans, who had spent years watching fuel trucks crawl across borders, this was more than infrastructure. It was liberation. A stable, direct, secure supply of fuel, something the country had never truly possessed. A lifeline from the Atlantic Strait into the heart of a landlocked nation. But what truly electrified the public was the idea that Zimbabwe, long seen as an energy victim, could become an energy hub. People spoke with a newfound sense of possibility. Business owners imagined machinery running without interruption. Miners imagined uninterrupted shifts. Parents imagined evenings without candles and hospitals without fear. And as Africa news outlets began reporting the scale of the deal, many older Africans quietly drew comparisons to the sovereignty pushes happening in Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré. Across the continent, patterns were emerging, patterns of nations refusing to remain dependent. Zimbabwe's moment had finally arrived. The real turning point in this story did not come from the billion-dollar announcement itself. It came from something far more symbolic, a moment loaded with history, tension, and irony. A decade ago, Aliko Dangote stood in a government office in Harare, frustrated, exhausted, and ready to leave. Officials at the time demanded mediation fees, favors, and backdoor approvals just to move his project forward. It was a wall of bureaucracy designed not to regulate but to extract. Dangote walked away, and as he left, doors closed across Zimbabwe. Investors took the signal. If the richest man in Africa can't operate here, who can? That memory lingered in the nation's consciousness, like a wound that never fully healed. So when Zimbabweans learned that Dangote had returned, this time to sign a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deal, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Older citizens who had lived through the Mugabe era whispered to each other in disbelief. Business owners who remembered the lost opportunities of 2015 held their breath. Could this finally be the chance that Zimbabwe had been waiting for? Or was this just another illusion that would crumble under internal politics? But then came the scene that pushed emotions to their peak: Dangote and President Mnangagwa standing together at the signing ceremony, committing to a 2,000-kilometer pipeline, a scale of ambition no one imagined Zimbabwe would ever see again. And yet 2 empty chairs behind them stole the attention of many observers. The first vice president and the second vice president, Chiwenga and Mahadi, were conspicuously absent. In Zimbabwe's political culture, such an absence is never accidental. It signals disagreement, rivalry, or unresolved power struggles. Those watching closely felt a jolt of tension. Was there resistance inside the ruling party? Were certain factions hoping the deal would fail? Zimbabweans are no strangers to political intrigue, and this absence rekindled the fear that internal sabotage could derail even the most promising opportunity. But outside that political inner circle, among ordinary citizens, hope overpowered suspicion. 29. And then the conversation expanded beyond Zimbabwe's borders. Western oil executives used to setting the terms of African energy began calling emergency analysis meetings. Chinese state companies deeply embedded in southern Africa quietly contacted their partners for updates. Everyone wanted to know. 30. How is Dangote doing this at 1/10 of our price? The answer stunned many African engineers, African contractors, African logistics networks. No foreign middlemen, no inflated budgets, no hidden ownership clauses. 32. That's when the narrative shifted from a Zimbabwean story to a continental one. 33 economists across Africa began arguing that this project marked a new era. For the first time, a major regional infrastructure project, pipeline storage terminals, cement plants, fertilizer production, and power facilities, was being built without external dependency. The fact that Zimbabwe would receive world-class infrastructure for a mere $1 billion, while Western and Chinese companies estimated $10–15 billion, created shockwaves. It suggested that Africa's biggest barrier was never capacity, it was who controlled the narrative of capacity. Meanwhile, Botswana, Zambia, and Malawi watched the development with a mixture of anticipation and urgency. The pipeline didn't end with Zimbabwe's borders. It created a potentially integrated fuel distribution corridor across 7 or 8 countries. For the first time in history, a private African company, not a Western conglomerate or a Chinese state entity, was building the skeleton of a regional energy network. A quiet realization spread across the region. Dangote wasn't just solving a problem, he was building an empire. This triggered an intense debate. Critics warned of a possible monopoly. If Zimbabwe becomes dependent on Dangote's fuel, what happens if prices rise? If he controls both supply and distribution, who checks his influence? These concerns echoed in academic discussions, business forums, and parliament halls. Yet at the same time, ordinary citizens felt something deeper, a sense of relief, even gratitude. For them, monopoly fears felt abstract compared to the very real nightmare of hospitals without power factories shut down and job losses that had touched every household. 30 Sanzen. In homes across Harare, men and women spoke of the pipeline with the cautious optimism of people who had been disappointed many times but still dared to hope. They saw in Dangote's return something symbolic, a belief that Zimbabwe was no longer a place investors avoided, but a place that could shape its own destiny again. And across the continent, African news channels began drawing parallels with the growing sovereignty movements in Burkina Faso under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré. A pattern was forming: African nations refusing dependency, choosing self-determination, and rewriting their economic futures in ways the world never expected. Zimbabwe's turning point had become Africa's new conversation. The first impact of the Dangote deal did not appear on balance sheets or government reports. It appeared in the small personal moments that define everyday life. In the township of Mbare, a butcher named Tende opened his shop one morning to find his refrigerator still humming something that hadn't happened in years. He stood in front of those cold metal doors for a long moment, almost in disbelief. For him, uninterrupted power wasn't an economic indicator. It meant fewer spoiled deliveries, fewer angry customers, and a chance to rebuild a business that had been dying inch by inch. All across Harare and Bulawayo, stories like Tende's began quietly surfacing, little victories that signaled a shift. Hospitals were among the first to feel a meaningful difference. For years, Zimbabwean doctors lived with the fear that the lights might die in the middle of a surgery. The constant growl of backup generators was as familiar as the sound of their own footsteps. But as soon as fuel supplies stabilized, thanks to the early logistical groundwork of Dangote's agreement, generators ran less often. A senior nurse at Paririnyatwa Hospital described it best. For the first time in a long time, we felt like we were treating patients, not fighting the darkness. That sense of relief was profound, almost spiritual. For factories, the change felt like a resurrection. Manufacturing plants that had once operated in unpredictable, staggered shifts suddenly gained confidence to run full production cycles. Managers who had spent years improvising around blackouts now spoke openly about rehiring workers, fulfilling backlogged orders, and reopening export agreements. The mining sector, long crippled by unreliable power, saw machinery come back to life. Miners who had been stuck in unstable part-time rotations returned to steady work, bringing new income to entire communities. But every shift in the economic landscape brings political consequences, and Zimbabwe was no exception. President Emerson Mnangagwa's administration immediately leaned into the renewed optimism. State media reported the deal as proof that Zimbabwe was open for business in a genuine, tangible way, not just as a slogan. For supporters of the ruling party, the Dangote project offered something rare, a credible example of progress after years of economic stagnation. For the first time in a long time, citizens could point to a policy that changed their daily lives. Yet the political landscape was far from unified. The absence of Vice Presidents Chiwenga and Mohadi during the signing of the agreement resurfaced as a point of tension. Inside ZANU-PF, those absences were read not as coincidence, but as quiet protest. Some party insiders feared that an infrastructure deal of such magnitude would shift economic influence away from traditional political power brokers and toward new alliances shaped by Dangote's presence. Internal fault lines, long dormant, began to vibrate beneath the surface. Outside of political circles, everyday Zimbabweans expressed a different set of concerns. While many celebrated the return of electricity and stable fuel, some worried about exchanging one form of dependency for another. If Dangote controlled the pipeline, the storage terminals, the fuel distribution network, and the related industries like cement and fertilizer, what safeguard existed against future price hikes? Could one man, no matter how respected, hold too much influence over a nation's lifeline? Economists debated that question intensely. Some argued that Zimbabwe had little choice but to embrace the opportunity. The country had spent decades suffocating under weak infrastructure and unreliable supply chains. Others warned that the nation must use this moment not as a destination, but as a launching point, leveraging cheaper fuel to industrialize, diversify exports, add value to its lithium and platinum reserves, and build local capabilities that would prevent long-term dependence. Across Africa, news platforms analysts drew parallels to other sovereignty movements on the continent, including in Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré. The message was consistent. Infrastructure brings power, but only disciplined governance can turn power into lasting independence. In the end, Zimbabwe's story stands at a crossroads, one where electricity is finally returning to homes, machines are roaring back to life, but political and economic choices made today will determine whether this moment becomes a renaissance or simply a brief, hopeful pause in a long struggle. From Washington's perspective, what happened in Harare was more than another African infrastructure deal. It was a shift in the global energy landscape, one that unfolded quietly without military alliances, sanctions, or diplomatic pressure. American analysts, especially those who follow energy security in Africa, found themselves confronted with a new and uncomfortable question. What happens when African nations begin solving African problems without foreign oversight? For decades, U.S. policy toward Africa has relied on the assumption that major infrastructure, especially cross-border energy infrastructure, would be financed, built, or at least influenced by Western institutions. The Dangote pipeline broke that pattern. In think tanks across Washington, specialists in African affairs were quick to note the strategic implications. A 2,000-kilometer corridor connecting Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe means less reliance on South Africa's energy system and less dependence on imported refined fuels from Asia or Europe. For American oil companies, this represents not just a lost opportunity, but a changing reality. Africa may be moving toward internal energy ecosystems that no longer need Western intermediaries. One senior fellow at a DC institute put it bluntly, "We're not just losing contracts, we're losing the narrative." Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Beijing watched the Zimbabwe deal with its own mixture of concern and calculation. For nearly 2 decades, China has dominated African infrastructure, particularly in transportation and energy. They built dams, roads, ports, and pipelines, usually through state-owned companies with high-interest loans attached. The Dangote model is the opposite: African engineers, African money, African control. For Chinese strategists, this wasn't just unusual. It was a challenge to the very template that made China the continent's largest development partner. If Zimbabwe thrived under this arrangement, if fuel prices fell and productivity rose, other nations might start wondering whether they needed foreign-built megaprojects at all. In Johannesburg, the mood was different, more anxious, more personal. South Africa has long served as the region's energy anchor with refineries, ports, and industrial capacity that neighboring states depend on. But a Zimbabwe that receives direct fuel from the Atlantic and develops its own industrial base threatens that position. South African commentators debated whether this pipeline might shift the balance of economic influence northward. Some warned that mineral-rich Zambia and Zimbabwe could form a new manufacturing cluster that pulls investment away from Gauteng and Durban. For ordinary South Africans struggling with their own energy crisis, the irony wasn't lost. Zimbabwe, of all countries, might now have a more reliable supply chain than the regional powerhouse itself. European reactions were subtler but no less significant. Energy analysts in Brussels saw the deal as another sign that Africa is diversifying its partnerships. Europe has long depended on Africa's natural resources while offering little in return beyond aid programs and political agreements. But a sovereign-driven infrastructure boom led by Africans complicates European leverage. Without financial control, influence becomes softer, less predictable, and much harder to maintain. What connected all these global reactions was a quiet, emerging realization. Africa may finally be recalibrating its position in the world, not by rejecting the West or the East, but by building alternatives that neither side controls. And as Africa news outlets began comparing this shift with the sovereignty movement in Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré, a broader pattern took shape, one that suggested a continent redefining power on its own terms. Zimbabwe's pipeline was no longer just a national project, it had become a global message. In the end, the story of Zimbabwe's 2,000-kilometer pipeline is not simply a story about fuel. It's about something much larger, much more fragile, and far more consequential: the chance to rewrite a nation's destiny after decades of darkness. Across Harare, Bulawayo, Gweru, Mutare, people are beginning to feel something they haven't felt in years: motion. A subtle but undeniable shift. Machines humming where silence once lived. Hospital wings lit at dawn. Small businesses daring to open their doors without glancing anxiously at the power schedule. But in moments like these, history teaches us to breathe slowly, because every opportunity carries a shadow. Every breakthrough contains a warning. Zimbabwe now stands at a crossroads where two futures compete openly. One future bright, ambitious, and within reach imagines a nation using this cheaper fuel to build factories, add value to its lithium and platinum, create manufacturing clusters, attract new industries, and finally escape the gravity of scarcity. The other future, quieter but more familiar, warns of a cycle Africa has seen too many times: new dependency disguised as progress, new concentration of power beneath the surface, and a return to instability if one man, one company, or one political faction holds too much of the nation's lifeline. The pipeline can be liberation. It can also be a trap. Everything depends on what Zimbabwe does next. Economists across the continent are already debating the ripple effects. If Zimbabwe succeeds, the model will spread fuel corridors from Angola into Zambia, from Tanzania into Malawi, from Senegal into Mali, and perhaps one day from Ghana deep into the Sahel. If Zimbabwe fails, it becomes another cautionary tale on the long list of African dreams, interrupted by poor governance, internal rivalry, or short-sighted politics. Across Africa news forums, many viewers compare this moment with what is happening in Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré, a reminder that sovereignty is never won by one decision, but by thousands of decisions made consistently over years. Zimbabwe may have opened the door, but walking through it requires discipline, unity, and a vision larger than any single leader or investor. And so the question returns to all of us, especially to you who have watched Africa for decades and understand how rare these moments truly are. Will Zimbabwe turn this lifeline into a legacy, or will it let hope slip back into the shadows? If this story opened your eyes to the scale of what's changing across the continent, tell me in the comments: what country should we investigate next? What hidden opportunity is the world still ignoring? And if you believe that Africans deserve development built on African terms, then please share this video. Subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines.